goes first in your mind when you hear about comparison and contrast?
When I encountered in grade 10, when I hear comparison, it means similarities. And when it's contrast, it's differences.
You're right, so let's find out the real meaning of comparison and contrast.
After defining the comparison and contrast, let us now know the true meaning of comparison and contrast. James?
Compare means describing similarities between two objects. For example, the essay on farm life versus city would provide at least one paragraph on how people's lives in the city are like the lives of the people that live on a farm. Basically, the comparison tells what they have in common.
For contrast, when a writer contrasts two things, he or she explains ways in which they are different. For example, after completing a unit of study on where people live, students should be able to provide several details about how life on a farm can be vastly different from life in a city. So, do not forget the transitional words they both have. For contrasting, we have transitional words such as although and yet, but, conversely, counter to, despite, even so, in contrast, in spite of, instead, however, nonetheless, on the other hand, otherwise, still, unlike, whereas, and
For comparing, also, as, both, equally, in a similar fashion, in comparison, in the same way, like, likewise, similarly to compare.
After knowing the true meaning of comparison and contrast, let us now know the techniques of the comparison and contrast.
First technique is separately. It involves describing one subject first and followed by the second subject. And its parallel approach is the black approach. This organizational pattern is most effective when used on short essays, such as in class essays. The body of such an essay is organized by discussing one subject point by point in complete detail before moving on to the next subject. In this approach, you describe all the similarities on the first body paragraph and then all the differences in the second body paragraph. Roy, what's the second technique?
Second technique is side by side. It discusses both items based on each point of comparison, and its parallel approach is point by point. This organization is especially useful if the reader should have trouble keeping track of the points. This organizational pattern is most effective when used on longer essays, such as comparison of two articles, short stories, or novels. The body of such an essay is organized by discussing one point at a time and how it applies to each subject before moving on to the next point. For long works, at least 3 points should examine, if not more.
Allegory, an extended metaphor that carries throughout an entire piece of literature that compares a situation in the story to a real-life situation. For example, let us compare Narnia, the movie, and the Bible. In Narnia, Aslan is God, while Edmund is Judas and the White Witch is Satan.
Simile. Comparing two things with the conjunction like or as. Simile is pretty easy as long as in the statement there is like or as, that's simile. For example, the soldiers are as brave as lions. Her cheeks are red like a rose. Roy's brain is like a tree. It's green.
Fun is using comparison to create cognitive links in a humorous way. For example, I'm glad I know sign language because it's pretty handy. So what do we use for sign language? Our hands, so it's pretty handy.
Metaphor. Comparing two things without the use of like or as. Asserting that one thing is another, such as education is your passport to satisfying employment.
Analogy, similar to the definition of comparison, referring to any comparison that expresses the similarities or differences between two things. For example, sinigang na baboy and dilagang baka. They are both delicious but they have different recipes.
Juxtaposition is placing two concepts, characters, ideas, etc. near each other so that the reader makes comparison between them and perhaps contrast them. Example, she is small, I am tall.
There are many ways to compare and contrast the features of items, people, events, etc. Many types of graphic organizers make it easier to examine these similarities and differences. For example, Venn diagram. It is a graphic organizer that is made up of 2 or 3 overlapping circles. In a Venn diagram, you will write your differences on both sides and their similarities on the part where the circle overlaps. Next is chart diagram. It is a type of graphic organizer that condenses and organizes data about multiple traits associated with many items or topics. Example:
Comparison and contrast in essay. Introduction and thesis. The introduction should cover the main point that you will be discussing. Introduction should also have a strong thesis statement. The thesis should overview the key similarities and the key differences between the two subjects. Next, comparison section. The first section of the essay should compare the 2 or more items being discussed. Then, provide all the details about the key similarities and use descriptive detail and examples to illustrate your points. Then, the contrast section. After explaining the similarities, you should explain the main difference between the subjects. You should also use actual examples and provide enough detail so that the audience can follow the logic of your contrast section. Lastly, the conclusion. After comparing and contrasting thoroughly, briefly summarize the key similarities and differences. After a brief recap, explain the significance of the similarities and differences, and why these differences and similarities might affect the audience decision. Summary of comparison and contrast. Comparison means to identify the ways in which 2 different subjects are similar, while in contrast, it means to identify the ways in which 2 similar subjects are different. Are you trying to define something? Do you need your readers to understand what something is and what it is not? Then, the comparison and contrast method of development is particularly useful in extending a definition, or anywhere you need to show how a subject is like or unlike to the subject. Then it's finished! I hope you learn more about comparison and contrast. Thanks for watching!